that I have on my radar this week is Texas A&M going on the road versus Notre Dame. And, last year was such a fun game, and it definitely kind of came to my mind because when I was watching the Notre Dame Miami game last week, what kind of really struck me more or less just how much Miami really kind of controlled the line of scrimmage. Because Notre Dame, I mean, they're famous for their defense. They're so consistent on that end of it. So to me, it was just kind of startling, I suppose, that they really couldn't generate much pressure on the defensive line front. And also it just kind of seemed like they're a little bit out of sync in terms of them offensively. Now granted, to some degree, you kind of have to expect that with a guy like CJ Carr, but he was solid. And I think he deserves some credit for that. He went 19 for 30 for 220 yards with 2 touchdowns. But there were definitely some times where you could tell that they were being a little bit conservative in terms of the play calling, which obviously makes sense. And aside from the 65-yard play that Eli Rondon had, I mean, there wasn't really many explosive plays. However, it does kind of make you think to yourself, if you're Notre Dame, how can they utilize Jeremiyah Love, which to me, at least last week, I didn't really get to see enough of him, which kind of leads me to believe why I think this is going to be such an intriguing matchup and why I think ultimately the winner of this game is going to be whoever's going to be able to run the ball better. And the reason why I say running is because Texas A&M in the past couple of weeks has kind of struggled in terms of rush defense. And it's something that they dealt with last year as well. I mean, when I look at this team, Texas A&M, they brought in a lot of key transfers like Casey Concepcion, who had 6 passes for 73 yards and 2 touchdowns last season. And then, of course, when I think about Texas A&M too, obviously last week they played Utah State. They won 44-22. They took care of Texas San Antonio the week before that. But what's, I guess, interesting is, yes, the Texas A&M has averaged about 5 yards per carry, but they also gave up over 200 yards versus Texas San Antonio, who I think, in my opinion, is probably one of the better Group of 5 schools. However, they kind of been in that situation where they're definitely came out a little bit slower than we kind of anticipated this year. And all things considered, that's really where the matchup is for me, right? Because we know that's where Notre Dame's strength is in terms of them being a rushing attack, even though we really didn't get to see that as much last year. And Texas A&M is kind of sort of in the same boat offensively. Obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that Colin Klein does want to try to throw the ball more. And I think most importantly, Texas A&M has to prove that they can throw the football, because it's pretty obvious that going into this game, Texas A&M is going to put a lot of pressure on Marcel Reed. And that's been one of the big questions about him is, yes, he's a really intriguing guy to watch. I mean, he's freakishly athletic. He is a really great runner. He's, it's obvious why Texas A&M is so fascinated by him too. And there's a reason why they chose him over Connor Wegman as well last season. But to me, if you ask me this, really, I mean, because both these defenses are so stout. I mean, if you talk about Texas A&M defensively, I mean, there's so many guys that I like. I mean, you got Cassius Howell, who's had 3 sacks. You have Scooby Williams, who's had 6 tackles. They have so many great weapons there. And then Notre Dame as well. Obviously, Jalen Stroman is going to be, in my opinion, probably one of the biggest standouts of that defense too. But I guess the reason why I focus so much about their rushing attacks, Texas A&M, like I said, they've struggled with being able to stop teams from rushing the ball. And they've also struggled, historically speaking, in terms of covering the spread on the road. Last year, they went 2-3 on the road against the spread, and then 3-9 overall away from home. So there definitely is kind of a category there in terms of them not being able to do that as well. And also Notre Dame won last year too, which is definitely something to keep in mind, especially since Notre Dame was actually considered the underdog last year. However, I'm going to point out that I think that this game is going to be incredibly close. I think it's going to be a low-scoring game. I think the defenses are primarily going to be driving the bus in terms of them figuring this out. But to me, what the real difference maker is going to be in terms of this Texas A&M and Notre Dame matchup is the fact that, one, Notre Dame had an extra week to prepare for this game since they technically got a bye. But I think most importantly, I think to me, Notre Dame is just more of a balanced team. And I think the real difference maker this week is going to be Jeremiyah Love. Because if you ask me, I anticipate Jeremiyah Love having a really strong game this week. I think they really kind of took away from, they didn't get to utilize him and Price as much as I would have liked to see. However, I think it was probably important to some degree that CJ Carr did get some critical moments in there versus that Miami game where they really kind of let him run with it. And I think he really kind of maximized that. And he's going to end up figuring it out because, yeah, he had that one interception, but hey, it's not the end. It's not the end of the world considering it's only his second start. And, he's definitely going to be a pretty solid kid moving forward, especially when you think about the last couple seasons in terms of Notre Dame quarterbacks. You think of Riley Leonard, you think of some other transfers that they primarily have had transfer guys. So you kind of sit there and say to yourself, or Sam Hartman, I think is the guy that I'm thinking of. So you sit there and say to yourself, hey, I think it's actually pretty refreshing if you're a Notre Dame fan that it's nice for them to finally have a guy who's a little bit younger and someone that they can develop and someone that's not necessarily going to be something that they're talking about every single year in terms of, having to find a quarterback. But in terms of Texas A&M, what they can possibly do to make this better as well is, at the moment, Texas A&M, I mean, their rushing attack hasn't been elite necessarily this year. They're 38th in a success rush rate this year. The offensive line, I think, is held up pretty strong, and I definitely see that you're definitely kind of getting more of a balanced vibe from them, which is definitely refreshing because I think that's something that Colin Klein and this offensive staff is something that they've been wanting to do. But but again, this is why I go back to the rushing attack because to me that's the big question mark with Notre Dame is going to be their own. It's going to be their own rushing offense that they kind of didn't really get to see much last year in terms of really kind of see who's going to have the better rhythm in terms of running the ball because. At the same time, too, I don't necessarily think either of these teams have to necessarily dominate in terms of running the football, 2-1, for example. I think what we really just need to see is who's going to be more poised, who's going to be more efficient, and most importantly, who's going to be able to make less mistakes and just do just enough to the point where either CJ Carr or Marcel Reed is going to be able to make those reads correctly, to be able to not make mistakes, to be able to be poised, and to most importantly, just have the talent on the field do their thing. But if you ask me, these are two teams that are incredibly evenly matched. I think they both have kind of built their program. Mike Elko and Marcus Friedman have both built their programs in a remarkably similar way. But I give Notre Dame the slight advantage of this game simply because I think they are more talented and I think they are going to figure it out in terms of running the ball more. And assuming that they get Love and Price going, I anticipate this game once again being a low-scoring, close kind of game, pretty similar to maybe that 23-20 sort of figure.